A lot of people are angry at the moment because they feel there is a two-tier justice system going on, in particular with regard to this illegal migrant at the centre of the Epping Hotel scandal who was found guilty of sexual assaults, and the reason being he was given a lesser prison sentence than those who were protesting against the use of the hotels. But as usual, it's not quite that straightforward, so I do have some comments on it in this video, which if you see the headline, you might just think that this is hugely unfair and that's all there is to it. There is always more to it, which is why, again on this occasion, and more frequently recently, the judge has released some sentencing remarks, which I feel are important to get some clarification and some context about this whole thing. I did talk about this case in particular on my Black Belt Secrets video, which you can see on screen. I'll link it below. But in short, Hadush Kebatu was sentenced to 12 months after being found guilty on 5 different charges with multiple victims. Now, the reason that people think this is unfair and two-tier is that the 3 protesters pictured below Kebatu here each received a lengthier prison sentence than Kebatu himself for those horrific offences that they were protesting about in the first place. But as I said, this is not quite as straightforward as it seems. So very, very briefly, without going through every shred of detail because this is available online, I will go through some of the sentencing remarks here against the 3 men, who each of whom pleaded guilty to violent disorder. So as a very brief outline of the facts, on the 11th of July this year, a peaceful protest developed outside the Bell Hotel in Epping. The judge said this was rightly described as a small, low-crime residential location. The initial protest was policed by local officers, attended by 200 people. But this quickly expanded, tensions escalated, and it developed into a series of running clashes with the police, both in Epping Town Centre and around the Bell Hotel. Judge says the most serious example was an incident on the 17th of July, and this is the date that concerns the present case. That day, the manager of the Bell Hotel received a call from an unknown male asking, "Are you ready for tonight?" Further phone calls received by the police describing that the group chats had been established to organise attendance at the Bell Hotel. Police were informed that attendees had been advised to mask up and bring rage, and that the plan was to attack migrants at the hotel for being racist scum. The judge said at its peak, the protest involved approximately 500 people gathered outside the hotel. Officers were subject to sustained attacks for many hours, including being pelted with bottles, eggs, and other objects. Counter-protest was there but unable to take place. They were driven back into retreat. The judge said the impact on the community was important. Damage was caused to public locations, including a school and various other things. The chief inspector said, "In my 20 years of policing, I've never witnessed disorder of this scale in Essex, and certainly not in a town like Epping. They've left a lasting impact on the community, our officers, and the wider response across the country." The judge said, "Each of you played a role in what happened. In deciding the appropriate sentence, I must of course focus on your actions, but the context of wider public disorder is also relevant. Let me be plain. Attending a protest is not the issue, and that is not what you're being sentenced for. And this is important for the context that you may see on social media. But what each of you did went beyond attendance at a protest and became criminal when you acted as you did." Now, just to be clear, each of them pleaded guilty to the violent disorder here, which they've been sentenced by this judge. The judge says, "Mr. Williams, you were identified from social media and body-worn footage. You were wearing a distinctive outfit and a Union flag as a cape. You got onto a roof of the Bell Hotel and attempted to ring the bell. You got onto the roof of Tower School. To do the latter, you forced entry to the school. You also engaged in aggressive conduct towards the police cordon, attempting to maintain order. During this clip, you're encouraging others to breach the cordon, shouting, 'Line up, line up.' And then you charged at police, laughing as you did so. You kicked at an officer and you were arrested on the 20th of July, having attended a further protest planned that day. Mr. Smith," the judge says, "you were seen punching at an officer's shield, participating with others in an attack on the cordon. You were also captured on body-worn video, remonstrating with officers." Judge said there was pushing between you and officers as the line was choked with aggressors. You were recorded drinking what appears to be beer from a glass bottle, again covering your face. Around this time, numerous missiles were thrown at the police, although the judge said, "I can't be sure that you were responsible for throwing the bottle," and were arrested on the 20th of July. Mr. Peagram, you were identified from body-worn and other footage. You were seen to kick a police carrier door, having pushed through the crowd specifically to do so. Throw an unknown object at a police carrier and throw a can at police. You were part of a group seen to push the police cordon, grabbing an officer's shield and kicking out. You were present at the location for several hours. When interviewed, to your credit, you admitted your conduct and said that you thought you behaved childishly. Regarding Mr. Williams, the judge said, after trial, the sentence I would have imposed, there wasn't a trial, but after a trial, I would have imposed 3 years and 3 months, because violent disorder is taken very, very seriously. I'm going to compare and contrast with the migrant in just a moment, which is why people think that this is two-tier, but I'll come back to that in a minute. The judge said, I'm satisfied that this offence was motivated, at least in part, by hostility towards members of a racial group based on their membership of that group. I treat this as a further aggravating feature which increases the sentence to 3.5 years. You're entitled to 33%, a third, credit for your guilty plea. The sentence is thus 2 years and 4 months custody, serving up to 40% in custody and the remainder on licence. Regarding Mr. Smith, we move down. The judge said after trial, considering both the aggravating and mitigating factors, the sentence I would have imposed is 2.5 years. And again, motivated at least in part by hostility towards members of a racial group, increasing the sentence to 2 years, 9 months, again a third off for guilty plea, and thus the sentence was 1 year and 10 months. Regarding Mr. Peagram, the judge said after trial, the aggravating mitigating features balance, the sentence I would have imposed is 3 years. And again, the judge was satisfied that it was motivated at least in part by hostility towards members of a racial group, which increased the sentence to 3 years, 3 months. Again, a third off for guilty plea, and thus the sentence imposed is 2 years and 2 months custody. As to why the judge did not suspend the sentences, which I've seen some people ask, a sentence needs to be between 14 days and 2 years for the judge to consider suspending it. And that was only the case for Dean Smith, for whom the sentence after the deduction was 1 year and 10 months. The judge did go through this analysis here and said that as it is less than 2 years, I've considered the imposition and whether I would suspend it. In your favour, you've no previous convictions, the sentence is likely to impact a third party, and there's reasonable prospects of rehabilitation. Against those factors, the judge said, the offending calls for an immediate prison sentence. You've a medium risk of future offending and pose a medium risk of serious harm to members of the public. I note, for example, notwithstanding your explanation for why you attended the protest, you were arrested at a further protest shortly thereafter. Overall, I've decided that I cannot suspend the sentence given the seriousness of the offending, and it must be immediate. So now, of course, people will now say, well, all of these sentences are more severe than that of Kebatu, who was the centre of the original offending which people were protesting in the first place. Now, this is why I say I always look to the sentencing guidelines. Now, I did talk in more detail about Kebatu's offending on my Black Belt Secrets channel video, which I'll link below. You can go and watch that again to remind yourself. But when you see headlines of the broad nature of that offending, and I'm jumping around the algorithm a little bit for the use of words here, but when you see the headline and the broad nature of that offending, you might think the worst possible kind of offending. But of course, it is on a wide spectrum. So simply touching somebody in a certain way is a certain kind of offence, and that might be on the very lower end of that spectrum, which is where the sentencing guidelines provides quite a broad, in fact, range of sentences that the judge can impose. Now, if you think that it doesn't matter how minor this offending might be, it should be a severe sentence, then that is an issue you need to take up with the sentencing guidelines, not whether or not this judge in this case with these 3 men is being too harsh on these 3 men. The only alternative is to lower the sentencing for violent disorder, for which they obviously pleaded guilty, and it is something that we absolutely want to discourage. We don't want people throwing things at police. We don't want people being violent and aggressive towards police or damaging property in a protest or anything else. It gives peaceful protest a bad name, and it is absolutely something that we want to stamp down on, because once it gets out of control, there's all told damage and people get hurt, police get hurt, and that is obviously something that we take very, very seriously. That said, that aside, we should then be looking at the sentencing guidelines for this type of offending for Kebatu here and decide whether or not this is sufficient, because many people will feel that this is not a sufficient sentence because he only received 12 months, which is obviously less than these 3 protesters. But that doesn't automatically make it two-tier in the way that this judge for these 3 protesters has applied the sentencing, but it could be seen as two-tier if you disagree with the sentence Kebatu has been given and think that that should be much more severe. Now, when you say it on the face of it, the the guy who is responsible for the offending which caused the protests gets a lesser sentence than those protesting it. That sounds very much two-tier. But remember, the 3 who have been sentenced pleaded guilty to violent disorder. It is absolutely something that we need to stamp down on. There are typically very serious sentences imposed for such kind of offending because we want to stamp that out. And comparing it to Kebatu's offending is completely different. So it is an unfair comparison, but when you throw them into the same story, that's why it sounds two-tier. But if you have a problem with it, it's the sentencing for the offending of Kebatu, which I've talked about in my secrets video, linked below. Go and watch that, and you'll get an idea for whether or not you agree with that sentence or not. That is why people find it two-tier. I thought this would be helpful. If it is, please do like the video, subscribe to the channel, share it with somebody, comment. All of that stuff helps the algorithm, and it helps my channel grow. And for that, I thank you for watching.